It's such a pleasure to talk to you all today. I'm going to change gears slightly, and I just want to remind you in the morning, for those of you here, Professor Lasker was talking about choosing wisely being as much about doing no harm to society as doing no harm to patients. So this is a slight gear change to be talking about doing work, looking at societal. What's happened here? Is it broken? So this is about scholarship looking at the global political economy of cancer. And I, first of all, no disclosure slides. I guess the other day after clinic, I was relaxing, having a glass of wine, and I thought to myself, what am I going to say that's going to be genuinely different and sort of but complements the whole theme? So I've split it into three distinct groups. The first is I'm going to just tell you what on earth political economy is, because this probably isn't familiar to many of you. And then I'm going to actually give you two case examples and then end on a single slide as a kind of wrap up, more a challenge really. It's a fascinating area of scholarship because it's all about power and money. Who has the power to make decisions? Where is the money coming from? Who controls the money? And unfortunately, in political economy, most of the scholarship is actually written as books. So you can't really go into the literature unless you start reading some really heavy duty books. And these are the two I would recommend you start with. The first one is Social Dictatorships, written by a friend of mine, Ferdinand Ebel, looking at how Middle East dictators have used health and welfare spending to manipulate their populations. It's absolutely fascinating, based on a lot of research over many, many years, and it's considered to be the high watermark in this area. The other one is, and I'm going to have to be nice to the French here, which really goes against the grain, is about Thomas Piketty. Now, Thomas Piketty, French sociologist, wrote this incredible book. It's called Capital in the 21st Century. It is hard work. It took me about 5 times to read. But it's about inequalities, and it's about exactly what Pramesh was talking about earlier, which is where do we make the political decisions to allocate our resources? And why do some societies spend so much and other societies spend so little? It's also a study, of course, of geopolitical forces that affect cancer control here. And, Bhavna's already alluded to the fact about climate change, but it also studies how things like recessions, other major healthcare disruptions like COVID affect the particular disease discipline that we're in. So you can imagine here the kind of sort of methodologies we're talking about are health policy, it's political science, it's health services and systems research, it's health economics work. Those are the sorts of disciplinary areas that sit here. And finally, it's also about how on earth you close the inequality gaps in cancer. And this comes up again and again and again. And we live in a massively unequal world. I don't need to tell anybody here about that. What's really scary is it's getting worse, not better. By any measure, if you look at the Nordic countries at the moment and look at something called the Gini index, which is an inequality index, they're actually starting to divide. Even in the Swedens, the Finlands, Norways, it's the first time we've ever seen it in contemporary history. So this inequality gap is already there and it's growing. It also speaks to the fact of what on earth can you truly deliver in a place like Ethiopia when you have an individual on $3 per day as the average income. So this is the global reality, and political economics interfaces very heavily with the big disciplines, particularly in macroeconomics, in IMF and other areas, to try and make those decisions. So first case is progressive universalism for sustainable cancer care, and you've heard a lot about that today already. I'm going to start with this. I've got a bit of a problem moment. Okay, this is your value equation. You've heard all about this all today, okay? Value equals outcomes divided by cost. But we have a massive problem in healthcare, and this is what the problem is. It's called the Baumol issue. Now, Bill Baumol wrote this in the 1960s. He said, look, there's a massive problem in healthcare. Productivity can never improve. Technology does not improve productivity or efficiency in healthcare. Every time you put a new technology in, a new pill, a new surgical intervention, a new type of radiotherapy, productivity actually goes down because it actually requires more human capital. The second problem is wages go up. It is an unavoidable fact. Now, technologies in most other disciplines actually increase productivity. They don't in healthcare. So the cost of disease is, as we get better at treating cancer, it gets more expensive. This is a really, really big problem. The other problem with the value equation, and kind of it's already been alluded to, Bashal talked very elegantly about this, is, what are we talking about with outcomes? Whose outcomes? How do we define those? Where do we get the evidence from? So it's an oversimplification problem. The other problem, looking at cost, for example, is price volatility. A
Pill today is 100 rupees. Next month, it's 1,000 rupees. Volatility in healthcare for any technology, pharmaceutical, radiotherapy, is hideous. Miscalculation, subjectivity, I could go on and on. So I've got a bit of a problem with Porter's original equation, V equals O over C. He likes to talk about it being E equals MC squared. But there's a bit of an issue with this. And I think rethinking what we mean by value, I think is going to be critical going forward, because it stands at the moment, this in the political economy space doesn't add up. And there's a lot of critique at the moment of value-based healthcare and about whether this is nothing more than another Trojan horse for making a great deal of money in the private sector. I'll leave you with that thought. We also talk about where we spend our money allocate. And I don't want to, you've had lots of examples of India, etc. I want to do a completely different example here. One of the big questions I have, because I work in a lot of areas of conflict, is spending money on cancer care for refugees worth it? We have conflicts now in major developed countries. We've seen the Syrian conflict. We've obviously got Ukraine war at the moment with Russia. And there's a big issue here in the UNHCR refugee agencies of whether or not they should be paying for cancer care. Now, we did this piece of work looking at the costs, and this took years to do, by the way. I'm not going to go into the methodology. The cost of treating Syrian cancer patients in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Now, ignore Lebanon now, because this was done before Lebanon imploded, basically. But Jordan and Turkey are relatively socialized systems. Hashitepe, Istanbul, King Hussein Cancer Center, etc. But look at the difference in the cost per instance case, age standardized. Between 4,300 point estimate in Jordan up to about 12,000 in Turkey. These are the same pretty much disease groupings and costings that they're using, etc. But the differential impact here is huge in terms of the burden to be paid in individual countries. So this is great. Okay, you now have a cost, but as you know, so what? What's the outcome? How well are these refugees doing? Is there a big difference where you go? And this is what political economy does. It doesn't make any judgments. It just says, these are your options. Now, you can either decide you can afford this, or you can say, I'm sorry, this is too much. We can't afford it. So it's about budget allocation decisions. That's what I'm trying to get at. And there's no right or wrong answer here, or indeed right or wrong figure, because it's a political decision whether or not you want to pay for this or not. The other thing we do a lot of in this space for progressive universalism is ask the question, how do we reduce productivity losses due to cancer? And what we mean by that is every time one of your patients dies before they're elderly, you have a productivity loss due to economic disappearance. They disappear out of the system. There is an economic consequence. If they have morbidity, that is also an economic consequence. Now, some of what we did with Rifat many years ago is we also asked the question, what about the social determinants of cancer? And of course, there are many social determinants leading patients into care, and unemployment is a massive one. And what we discovered, of course, is a really significant figure here. Basically, for every 1% increase in unemployment, you see about 1.5 additional cancer deaths per 100,000. That is a truism across all high middle income countries. Every bit of data set we could look at. And the reasons for this are relatively obvious. Number one, of course, this is about patients not presenting at all or presenting very late with disease, treatment abandonment, treatment foregone. Now, if you just look at, say, India, you went from unemployment from about 5% to 8% over the pandemic. I mean, giving you official figures, it was probably a lot higher than that. But the bottom line is that's what it translates into about 80 to 100,000 additional deaths. They will have happened. Those are lost productivities to the economy. You can multiply that by 5 in terms of lost economic productivity due to morbidity as well. So what it does is it allows policymakers to understand where they should be placing their funds. Is this about actually reducing unemployment or providing more care or doing both? But those are the sorts of things you can do with this. But then there's a whole range of other political economy issues for UHC. You've already heard about human capital deficit, a lot of interest about therapeutic geographies. Nearly all the work we do is all based on basically high-income countries. You have completely different therapeutic geographies here, and also the impact of expanding repertoires of technologies. Right, the second and last case study, the impact of private interest. Why is cancer biopharmaceuticals so powerful? This is really fascinating. Until the mid-2000s, actually the cost of R&D was going exponentially up, okay? And it's been going up for 60 years. And the reason was, number one is the regulators were demanding what they call better than the Beatles. In other words, a better record than the Beatles. And they were being much more risk averse. And then in 2010, the world changed with personalized medicine and targeted therapies. And what you saw is the biggest reversal we've seen in history. In other words, a massive decline in the cost of R&D for drugs and cancer drugs in particular, and also an incredible increase in productivity from 2010 onwards. It was like a force 11 seismic earthquake in pharma. No one could believe their luck that cancer drugs were coming along to save this massive productivity problem. And indeed, we did some work in 2007, which we didn't even realize at the time what it was. This was just sales in Western Europe and the USA of cancer drugs against all these other disease areas. And you can see they're all flatlining. And in fact, cardiovascular is starting to come down. Why? Interventional cardiology. Look at the growth area for cancer. Now, I'll show you some data, which is not in the public domain yet, but it's an analysis of SEC filings, Security and Exchange Commission filings, looking at return of investment for targeted therapies. And I'm not including IOs in these. The analysis, when it comes out, 435 to 551%, both the median and mean return on investments for cancer drugs. There is no commodity on this planet that gets those returns of investment, okay? And that's the percentage for those specific drugs down there. And I've just chosen those drugs out of random. It is absolutely stratospheric, the amount of money that's in the system. And this is the problem. What are fair profits for cancer and what is a just price? We basically have, in view of a lot of the industry experts at the moment looking in business, an unsustainable biopharmaceutical model. With the way that share buybacks work, etc., the view is this cannot continue. But I'm going to say something, unfortunately, a bit negative. I don't think anything will change until the train comes off the track with this, until the government's just absolutely point blank to allow this sort of thing to continue. And of course, I'm going to go back to the US. I know you said about the FDA, but the US market for biopharmaceuticals is absolutely massive. And this is it for cancer, 45% of the world value. And I said the only potential spoiler is China because they're the only competitor in this space. And there's a phrase we use in the regulatory space that says, you know, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. And it's really interesting because some work we've done with Mark Lithgow and Bashar's done work on this area as well, looking at regulators and the change. Project Orbis, for me, is actually quite a dangerous initiative because everyone talks about regulatory harmonization, but it's regulatory harmonization to the FDA standards. So that's the MHRA in the UK, the European Medicines Agency, the Australians, the Canadians. But this is all about alignment with US policy. And my question really is to regulators and the way that drugs are regulated is this the way you want to go? So final reflection, the last sort of a couple of minutes, because that all sounds sort of blindingly, obvious and probably a little bit negative. Chris mentioned this a little bit earlier about the break-even point through the political economy lens. So this is important because we have fantastic innovation. I do think trying to hold innovation back is a bit like being King Canute, okay? Pharmaceuticals, radiotherapy, imaging, molecular technologies. This is a massive juggernaut. Nothing can stop it. The issue really is the fidelity of delivering those technologies in our health services and systems here. And the problem here at the moment is there's a massive imbalance in the research endeavors around the world, where we're spending vast amounts on innovation, new technologies, and very little around the areas of health systems and services research, health policy, implementation science, health economics. There's been great health economics coming out from TMC, but we really have spent very, very little. And as Pramish alluded to, this sort of article we wrote in Nature, but I'm going to leave the last word to this chap called Melvin Kranzberg, who died in 1995. I met him only once. Terrific chap. He was the only surviving counterintelligence officer from Patton's army after the World War. He was superb. He was a German speaker and a major hunter of the Nazis. But he later went on to be president of the Health Technology Society for History. Terrific. What a thing to go on and do afterwards. And he came up with a whole load of different laws. And his first law of technological determinism with technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And it was really good because it's a challenge. It basically says, look, it's terrific having all these medicines, but really within the political economy space, what you need to do is work out how on earth you're going to deliver them in a way which is affordable and equitable and in the future sustainable. And it's not one thing, it's going to be multiple interventions at different levels, including changing philosophies and changing hearts and mind. And that's it, me done. Thank you very much indeed.